Welcome everyone. If you are here to hear about Woodcock, you are in the right place. My name is Brett Phelan, and I am the Science Director for the Harris Center for Conservation Education. We're the organization sponsoring tonight's presentation. By way of welcome, for those of you who might be new to the Harris Center, we want to welcome you. The Harris Center is a nonprofit organization based in the Monadnock region of Southwest New Hampshire. We help people fall in love with the natural world through land protection, conservation research, and education for all ages. So if you're local to us, I always like to share that we've protected more than 24,000 acres of land from development. Much of that is open for hiking, birding, and other recreation. We coordinate conservation research on our protected lands and throughout the region, including some really fun community science projects where we train community volunteers to help collect our data. And at the heart of everything we do is education for all ages, from babies in backpacks to residents of retirement communities and all points in between. We have an incredible calendar of events for the public each year, nearly 150 of them. Everything from Zoom talks like tonight to guided paddles and birding outings. So now we get on to the good part, the reason you're all here, to learn more about woodcock and woodcock migration. And I think we're going to hear some things that are going to really expand our notion of migration and our understanding of what that's all about. And our presenter, Liam Berigan, he's a wildlife biologist. His work focuses on the movements, habitat use, and survival of migratory birds. He graduated from Kansas State University in 2020 with a master's degree in biology, and he's now pursuing his PhD in wildlife ecology at the University of Maine. And he's a graduate student researcher for the Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Cooperative, which I have a feeling we're going to learn some more about. So without any further ado, Liam, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Brett, and thank you to the Harris Center for inviting me today. Can't wait to tell you a little bit more about woodcock. Well, thank you all. As I was so kindly introduced, my name is Liam Berigan. I'm a graduate student here at the University of Maine. I've been working on my doctorate here. Been here about 2 years. I anticipate being here two and a half more. And I'm a PhD student, member of the Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Cooperative. And today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about woodcock, specifically their ecology, a little bit just kind of the basics of what is a woodcock and what do they do and why do people love them so much. I'll then be speaking a little bit more about woodcock migration, more specifically, and some of the ways in which we can study woodcock migration and learn a little bit more about that and the kind of data we can collect using these new innovative techniques that we get the opportunity to use. And then I'll be speaking in the third section a little more about what woodcock migration can teach us about bird migration specifically, and some of the really interesting findings we've had from the project so far and where we're hoping to go next. But on that note, let's get to it. So I'm going to start with a little bit of woodcock ecology. And so the American woodcock is the most popular name for these birds, but as a beloved bird, they go by quite a few nicknames. Their Latin name is Scolopax minor, but they're very frequently called the timberdoodle. They're a little bit less frequently called the Labrador twister, bog sucker, and mud snipe. These tend to be more regional nicknames, but there are more nicknames for these birds than I could possibly fit on these slides, just mostly reflecting the enthusiasm that some people have for this utterly strange bird. One of the stranger aspects of these birds is that they are most closely related to birds such as sandpipers and plovers, like this pectoral sandpiper you can see in the slide here. They're in the family Scolopacidae, which is a family of birds that primarily lives on the coasts throughout North America and the rest of the world, where they eat primarily invertebrates that they pick out of the sand. Woodcock are also invertebrate enthusiasts, but they're very different from most of their close relatives in that they live very far from the shore, up in the upland forests and bogs and swamp, well, not quite in the swamps, but in the winter areas where they can find their favorite prey, which are earthworms. Earthworms are 98% of the American woodcock's diet. It's an incredible proportion, and their body is heavily specialized in order to help them forage for these earthworms. So you'll see this long bill that they have, which is a perfect plunging depth to stick down into the soil and try and pull out some earthworms. So their bill is actually specially adapted for this task. So if you look at this picture up here on the left, you'll see that the lower portion of the bill is straight, while the upper portion has a little bit of a bend up here at the tip. This is actually a prehensile bill. And so what happens is that when the woodcock shoves its bill down into the dirt and it feels around with its tongue and its bill to try and find for a worm, if it finds one, it can snap the top part of that bill shut, just like a pair of tweezers essentially, and then yank that earthworm up out of the soil before it eats it. Woodcock have a whole bunch of other really interesting specializations. They have an upside down brain for one. They also have eyes that are mounted on the sides of the head, but almost facing backward. If you hold a woodcock with the back of its head facing you, it can actually see you with both of its eyes. It's better vision behind it than it has facing in front of it. It's like this utterly strange bird that is like absolutely nothing else. But one of the reasons that woodcock are so well loved and so well known is through their reproductive displays. And so woodcock have something called a polygynous mating system, which means that the male's only real role in the reproductive process is to try and find females that will mate with him, after which his role is pretty much done. The female will then go off by herself into a wooded, secluded area, usually fairly nearby where the mating occurred. She'll find some nice little leaf litter to burrow into, hopefully underneath a low tree that might give her some shelter from any predators that might be nearby. They're very well camouflaged, and so they blend right in with the leaf litter. And then that female will nest there and incubate her eggs for 28 days. That's always exactly four eggs. And after those 28 days, those eggs will hatch and the chicks will jump up immediately and leave the nest. And the woodcock will then lead this brood of four, hopefully still four chicks, around in the leaf litter for another 36 days until those chicks are basically full grown. So within roughly 2 months, you go from brand new, newly laid eggs into full grown chicks. But I'm perhaps getting a bit ahead of myself because of the really one of the reasons that woodcock are so well renowned is for these great breeding displays that they do before this whole incubation process takes place. So the males will go out into these fields, often agricultural fields or areas that have recently been logged that are right adjacent to the forest, but not quite in the forest. And they'll sit out there in the open and they will make this peent noise, which I'll demonstrate later. And they'll peent repeatedly to try and bring in females until they believe they have an audience, and then they begin to make these aerial display movements. And so these start with rather low circles right above the treetops, which gradually get higher and higher and higher. And you'll see the calls go up in frequency as they do until they reach their maximum altitude, which they do a couple large loops. And then they make these very short swooping movements back down towards the ground until they land in exactly the same spot that they originally took off from, despite the fact that they just plunged down several hundred feet back to that exact same location. And so these are unfortunately a little bit hard to actually see as they're happening, as they're usually occurring at either dawn or dusk. Hence crepuscular displays occurring at either dawn or dusk, but they're usually very easy to hear. And so Maine Audubon actually produced a video of what these sound like during the displays. So these are the peent sounds that occur as the woodcock's on the ground. Usually spends most of its time on the ground before it takes off. Should be getting ready to fly in just a moment. And here it goes. So this chittering noise here, as you'll see, increases in frequency as the bird gets higher and higher and higher, up until it hits the apex of its flight, at which point we're going to start to hear a little bit more variation in the chittering. starts to reach the climax of the display. It's higher and higher and higher. This bird is now several hundred feet high, and then it stops and it drops in pure silence until it hits the ground, and then a single peep.
And if you are extra lucky, you may get to see the male's final display, bobbing with his wings raised as he approaches the watching female.
I've yet to see that portion of the display, but these are the actual movements when the bird's on the ground can be a little bit hard to see, just because it tends to be fairly dark by the time they're doing this, but the sound is pretty much always recognizable, and it's watching the display up close, especially when you can get fairly close to the bird, is rather magical. So thank you to Maine Audubon for that.
Good evening, back.
There we go, for that video. So this display is currently happening probably in your neighborhoods. So this display occurs in the spring from roughly the time when woodcock returned to your area, which in New Hampshire, I'm guessing was probably sometime in March. It varies a little by the year. But woodcock will find areas typically in fields near woodlots. So an area like this, where you have a little bit of grass cover, maybe 4 to 6 inches that the woodcock can kind of burrow itself into during the night and protect itself from predators, is ideal. But if you wait 30 minutes after sunset, just as it's starting to get dark and it's starting to get hard to see, that's when you'll typically start to hear the most woodcock. If you're interested in finding these displays, one really great place to get started is through the eBird website, which is a great resource for finding areas where woodcock are displaying either in past years or in your current year. If a woodcock is displayed there in years past, it's a very good indicator that you'll find them there in successive years. But a bit more into woodcock habitat. So woodcock are what we call an early successional bird species, which means that they really love habitat that has been recently disturbed and where there's a whole bunch of shrub cover growing back in the years after, shortly after disturbance. So in New England, when we're thinking of large scale disturbances, one of the things we're primarily thinking of is commercial forestry, where a clear cut or something similar has come through and knocked back the succession basically to the bare dirt. And so 2 to 5 years after a clear cut or something similar occurs, you'll start to see trees that are about this height here, which provide a whole bunch of really nice low cover that woodcock adore because it protects them from other animals that might think woodcock are tasty. Early successional species are not doing great, unfortunately. Woodcock are a very common species, but they have a lot of less common relatives, such as the golden-winged warbler and the less frequent, less closely related New England cottontail that are not doing quite as well. There's a lot less early successional habitat in New England than there used to be, largely due to the fact that there's a lot less agriculture in New England, and there's also a lot less commercial forestry than they're used to. So woodcock are unfortunately a species on the decline. They remain a fairly common bird species, but their populations have been declining at a rate of roughly 2% per year throughout their range, roughly since surveys began in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Unfortunately, woodcock are not the only birds that are in this situation. If you've been paying attention to bird news over the last few years, you may have heard of a paper that demonstrated that 2.9 billion birds have disappeared from North America since 1970. Of these 2.9 billion birds, the majority of those species have been very common species, such as house sparrows and European starlings, which are invasive, and especially red-winged blackbirds, which are not invasive. Woodcock currently fall into this category of a still fairly common species that is unfortunately undergoing some pretty significant declines, and that leads to a whole lot fewer of the still common bird species. So off that little bit more depressing note, into something a little bit more optimistic, things that we can do to help these woodcock. So hunting actually remains one of the best conservation tools for woodcock. Woodcock are not a very frequently hunted species compared to some more common species such as deer and turkey in New England, but it tends to attract a very small, dedicated group of hunters who really care about these birds a whole lot. And so one of the ways that woodcock hunting contributes to their conservation is through license sales. So you pay a certain amount of money to be able to hunt woodcock in any state in the United States. And that money goes into the state wildlife agency, which they can then pay to biologists who are paid to create woodcock habitat. And they can also spend it on research to try and figure out why woodcock are declining. Another great resource which has been funded by hunters is nonprofits, such as the American Woodcock Society, which helps to prepare private land, conservation easements on private land to help to create early successional habitat for both ruffed grouse and woodcock. And of course, a whole lot of woodcock hunters also undergo a lot of habitat management on their own private lands, which provides plenty of habitat for this species. Habitat conservation work is also occurring in on lands managed by a whole bunch of federal, state agencies, as well as a bunch of nonprofits and land trusts. When we're speaking of federal agencies, at least in the United States, we're primarily speaking of, at least for woodcock, the National Wildlife Refuge System, which manages some really good early successional habitat on a bunch of these national wildlife refuges. Many states, especially New England, manage for early successional habitat on their state wildlife management areas. And of course, I would be amiss not to mention land trusts and nonprofits, especially during a Harris Center talk, as in New England especially, they manage a whole bunch of land and often take many of these declining and early successional species into account during their land management. In addition to habitat conservation, we're also undergoing a lot of research to try and figure out why woodcock populations are declining and try and figure out ways to best sustain these populations into the long run. So some of the more important threads in woodcock research today, and some of the ones I'll be talking a lot more about, is research on woodcock survival, trying to figure out whether woodcock are declining during their breeding season, their wintering season, or their migratory seasons, so that we can best protect woodcock at the time of year in which they're having the hardest time. We're also engaged in research into woodcock habitat use to try and figure out, make sure the areas that we're conserving for woodcock are the areas that woodcock are actually using, make sure that our conservation actions are as effective as possible. And finally, also learning more about woodcock migratory timing so that we can better identify the periods in which woodcock are migrating and better target our conservation actions to conserve woodcock during those periods. But that's the end of our woodcock ecology section. If anyone has any questions about woodcock ecology before I start to move into some of the more research components, this would be a great time to ask them.
It looks like Janet has a question. She says, in North America, glaciers wiped out any native earthworm species in the northern US and Canada. If 98% of a woodcock's diet is earthworms, what were they eating after the glaciers receded and before Europeans brought invasive earthworms? And a follow-up question is, if we could help woodcock numbers increase, could they help decrease the invasive earthworm populations that are damaging our forest duff layer? Those are good questions, Janet.
It's a really interesting question. That one actually, the earthworm question comes up a lot more than one would think. And the question is, it's hard to say for certain. Earthworms are an invasive species. They were imported from Europe, I believe, Europe, Asia, the old world. They were imported from the old world. And so these are a fairly recent development in North America. That being said, there were native worm populations in North America before earthworms got here. What we think is most likely the case is that before those invasive earthworms got here, woodcock fed primarily on those native worm populations and probably used a slightly different type of habitat to what they currently use in order to best exploit those areas where those native worms were. That being said, having these really nice juicy earthworms all over North America probably improved woodcock populations considerably. And so woodcock have probably done very well since those earthworms came here. The same is probably true for commercial forestry. So regarding keeping earthworm populations down, that's an excellent question. I've actually been trying to find a lot more information on earthworm research just to try and better model woodcock populations. I have not really been successful. I'd love to know the answer to that.
Question. Does anyone else have other questions before we move on?
I actually do.
Oh,
I can speak now. I know. Thank you for the control of that, Brett. So my question is actually related to that question, which is what I was wondering is before there was commercial forestry and agriculture in North America, what do we think their habitat was? I mean, if they were eating these native worms and you said their habitat would have been slightly different, what do you think it was, or do we know?
Excellent question. Best that I can determine in that there are a whole bunch of woodcock species scattered across the world, which tend to use, I believe, early successional habitat. I'm pretty sure that they still used early successional habitat. Early successional habitat would have come from different sources than it currently does, which is primarily through commercial forestry, development, that sort of thing. And so, for example, indigenous land management would be one big way that that might happen. Forest fires, particularly through the Northeast, would have created these vast swaths of early successional habitat. We know that habitat was here, as we have a whole bunch of species in New England, such as the New England cottontail and golden warbler and ruffed grouse, that are very dependent on that habitat. I'm not entirely certain what that management regime would have specifically looked like. So, on researching woodcock migration. So, to research woodcock migration, our first step is typically to try and catch the bird. This is because in order to determine survival, for example, and try and measure where an individual bird goes, often the first step is to attach some sort of band or some sort of tag that we can use to identify that individual bird later on in its life. And so we capture these birds using one of two methods, either through spotlighting or through mist netting, both of which I'll explain in just a moment. Before I get into that, some really important disclaimers. All woodcock capture that I refer to today is done with both state and federal permits through either the United States or through Canada. This is all done only in cases in which it is necessary for the conservation of these woodcock. And definitely, please do not do this at home. But to spotlight woodcock, if you theoretically did have a banding permit, the way that we do this is we go into these fields that woodcock use at night. Woodcock habitat differs a little bit between daytime and nighttime. During daytime, you tend to see them in forests. If you flush woodcock during a walk on, say, some beautiful land trust land, you'll probably be flushing them in their day roost habitat, which tends to be, they like these early successional stands where they can find them, but you can also find them sometimes just out in the forest. During nighttime, though, they transition into more of a field-based habitat, where they like these large agricultural fields, sometimes ones that haven't been mowed in a little while, where you can find a little bit of that low cover, 4 to 6 inches, which they can hide themselves away in. And so when we're out trying to catch woodcock, what we'll do is we'll find a nice field. It's a little bit overgrown, and we will mow some trails in it. And woodcock actually really like these mowed trails because it allows them to see predators that might be coming towards them. They have a very good sense of sight, not quite as good a sense of hearing as their sense of sight. And so they love to be in the center of these mowed trails where they can see everything around them. If they see anything that spooks them, they can go off into the area next to the trail where there's a little bit more cover and they can hide. So what we'll do is we will walk along those mowed trails at night, usually in pairs of 2. One person with a big light and another person with a hand net. The person with the big light shines it back and forth to try and find a woodcock. And if they do, they shine the light at the woodcock, and the other person, hopefully without being illuminated, drops the net on top of the woodcock. And the whole process is very safe for the bird. And with a little bit of practice, we get fairly good at it. We can actually do this with ATVs as well. And the only real difference here is that the person with the net rides in the back, and that allows us to do this process a little bit faster if we're going through really large fields. So that's one process for catching woodcock. The other is with mist nets. Mist nets are this method for catching birds, which are used really widely with both passerines and also woodcock. That is essentially a very fine mist net, a very fine fish net. So you can just barely see it in the photo here, which is, to be honest, kind of the point. The idea is that you get this really fine net that you string up, and that especially in times of low light, such as dawn or dusk, when we catch woodcock, the bird can barely see it while it's flying. And so the idea is that we put these nets up between their day and their night habitat when they're flying between those two habitat types. And if we set the net correctly, woodcock will fly right in and they'll hit the net and then they'll safely plop down into one of these pockets beneath each of these little strings here. And after that, with a little bit of skill and a little bit of practice, you can untangle these woodcock fairly quickly and safely take them back, in which you can attach a band or a transmitter. So traditionally, most woodcock studies have used primarily bird bands, which are these little metal bands with a unique number on them that we can attach to birds and use it to individually identify that bird later on in its life. So the hope is that you catch this woodcock, you put a little band on the woodcock, and then you release the woodcock. And hopefully at some point, through either a hunter recovery or through another bander who happens to find your bird, you can then find this bird later in its life, and it will tell you, A, how long that bird survived, which is really useful information if you're trying to calculate survival, and B, where that bird went, which gives us a little bit of information about where these birds are traveling. This method really was the basis of most modern woodcock research, but it has some significant drawbacks. First of all, if you never see the bird again, you really do not get any information from this method. And our rate of seeing birds again is very, very low. Of every 100 birds that we band in this manner, we only ever relocate 2 birds. And so that's a whole bunch of birds which we're capturing and attaching bands to that we just never hear from again. This is also very coarse scale data. If we do happen to band a bird and we do find it again somewhere, let's say we band a bird in New Hampshire and we find it again in Alabama, we only really have data from those 2 points. And so we know very little about the locations that the woodcock traveled to in between those 2 points. And so this has made some really recent advances in technology very interesting. What I'm talking about specifically here is the use of satellite GPS transmitters. And so these transmitters weigh somewhere between 4 and 6 grams, and you can attach them to the back of a woodcock where it rides right above the tailbone, just like a fanny pack. And each of these transmitters has a loop on each side, which goes down around the leg of the bird. We use actually stretch magic jewelry cord for these, which gets a little bit flimsy after about a year or so. And it's designed so that after the transmitter has worn out its battery life, the stretch magic eventually cracks and the transmitter falls off the bird, allowing it to live the rest of its life unhampered by a transmitter. So the really miraculous thing about these transmitters is that they can both contain a battery, which will last for 2 to 8 months, depending on the schedule at which you have it taking locations, and also a GPS unit that can record the location of the woodcock as often as you'd like with the same accuracy as your cell phone might have. And so we can program these transmitters to take locations, say once every day or once every few days. And then once that transmitter is full, its memory is full, it will broadcast those locations back to a waiting satellite, which can then record that information and transmit it back down to a base station for which I can access all those locations on the internet. And so these transmitters end up broadcasting roughly once a week, which means that I can take that information and put it on our website roughly in real time. And we can get a very, very accurate view of where woodcock are traveling and what they're doing almost as those movements are happening. This allows us to study woodcocks, migration and life history, and identify potential threats and conservation opportunities. So this new technology has really led to the formation of our group, the Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Cooperative. This was founded by my 2 faculty advisors, Eric Blomberg and Amber Roth, in 2017, and has been slowly growing since then to include 34 organizations. Our organizations span federal agencies, both in the United States and in Canada, a whole bunch of state and provincial organizations as well, and also including nonprofits and other universities that are all working together to deploy these tags and to analyze the information that we're getting from them. So together, our goal is to seek to learn more about these strange woodcock migratory patterns that I'll show you in just a little bit, and also use woodcock as model organism, so as a demonstration of what other birds' migratory movements might actually look like. So one of the really novel things about our organization is that it allows us to study, is that the sheer magnitude of the sheer number of collaborators we have in this project allows us to study woodcock in a whole bunch of really different places, almost across the woodcock's entire range. So these circles, triangles, and squares here show locations where we capture woodcock and attach these transmitters. We're primarily focused on the eastern portion of the woodcock's range, but we're slowly starting to expand out into the central portion of the range as well, including in Alabama, which has been one of our more prolific collaborators, as well as recently in Louisiana, and we're starting to collect some samples in Wisconsin as well. By the way, the woodcock's range goes over here into the very eastern portion of Kansas, and it goes north up into Quebec, Newfoundland a little bit, and as far south as Florida. We have collaborators across the woodcock's range who have volunteered to go out each spring, summer, and fall and deploy those transmitters on any woodcock that they can find. This collaborative has been very successful so far. We've managed to procure funding for and deploy over 500 transmitters so far, which were recorded over 27,000 locations throughout the woodcock's range. This animation you're seeing on the right here shows the fall migration of woodcock as they travel from their breeding to their wintering ranges. They then spend a little bit of time down here during the winter before they start to move back up north during their spring migration. You'll notice the spring migration, they have a lot more stops occurring. You'll tend to see woodcock a lot more during their spring migrations than during the fall, just because of the shorter, just because stops are a little bit more frequent. You tend to find woodcock in places like your backyard or in cities a little bit more often. But to really demonstrate kind of the accuracy of these locations and kind of the sheer quantity of things that we can do just from a single set of woodcock locations, I'd like to show you something that one of our collaborators did. This is what's called an ArcGIS story map. And it's another way of showing this kind of data, this kind of spatial data that might be a little bit more intuitive. So this was created by the US Fish and Wildlife Service, which has funded a lot of our research so far. So this is particularly, here we're going to follow a single bird that was tagged in Rhode Island on October 18th, 2019. This was tagged by our collaborators at the University of Rhode Island at Great Swamp Wildlife Management Area right before the fall migration. And so when we tend to capture these birds, we tend to do it a week or two before we think they're going to migrate, so that we can get some locations from where this woodcock has been before and try and establish what its home range might be before it actually initiates migration. And so on October 18th, right as we captured this bird, it started taking some locations, and it stayed in that same general area where we captured the bird for a couple of weeks after. You can see that we have GPS locations which are fairly accurate to where this bird actually was, and it's using similar habitat right along the edge of this tree line to where we would actually expect to see a woodcock. So as the season went on, woodcock migration in the fall usually starts sometime around the October 15th, although not all birds migrate at once. Some wait a little bit longer before they start their migration. This was one of those birds that hung around into November in Rhode Island. As the season went on, it started to make a little bit longer movements. We call these pre-migratory ranging movements, and what it is the bird starting to get its quote-unquote sea legs. It's getting used to these longer migratory movements that's going to have to make lots of during migration. It's starting to broaden its home range just a little bit. So November 27th was the last date that we can confirm that this bird was in Rhode Island. And after that, sometime between November 27th and 29th, that bird made a 300-mile movement south into Maryland. So during migration, woodcock, like many birds, will make what we call migratory stopovers, which is they don't do the full migratory movement in a single day, but instead they break it up into several migratory sessions. So this first migratory session was its longest at 300 miles, after which it made a migratory stopover in this area in Maryland. So what woodcock tend to look for during their migratory stopovers is areas where forest is interspersed with agriculture. They tend to like those areas a lot. And what they'll do during these migratory stopovers is they'll attempt to rest, find somewhere where they can relax their exhausted wings. They'll try and refuel and try and find as many worms as they can. And they'll also attempt to avoid predation. So avoiding any predators such as other birds or mammals that might be trying to eat them during the daytime. Woodcock are what we call nocturnal migrants, which means that they fly during their migratory movements almost exclusively at night. Woodcock will take off an hour or two after sunset, usually sometime around 9 p.m., and then fly all through the night and try and get as far as they possibly can right before sunrise. 3 a.m. is usually when we start to see them actually settling down and start to look for areas where they can spend the daytime as they rest before the next flight. So these stopovers can last anywhere from a single day up to several weeks, depending on the woodcock. On December 3rd, this particular bird made another migratory flight, this time 150 miles south into North Carolina. On December 7th, it flew south again. You'll see that these movements start getting shorter and shorter. And this is really a behavioral transition from this woodcock as it moves from doing these long range migratory movements where it just needs to move south as fast as it can and starts to do more of a searching pattern where it's starting to look for where it wants to spend most of its time during the winter and starts to search for where the habitat might be best. So December 19th, it makes another really small movement down into North Carolina. And this is as far south as this bird moves during its migration. So December 19th, it starts to hang out in this area a little bit more, do a little bit more of the resting as the winter moves on. Once again, I'd like to point out the really accurate GPS locations we get here, which we can use to make these really broad inferences about the habitat the woodcock are using during their wintering as opposed to their breeding and migratory stages. This particular woodcock seems to like these two roads here on the 19th and 21st of December. It's also using some marshland up here on December 23rd. So this bird stays in the same general area during the winter. It has traveled nearly 500 miles during its fall migration. And it begins to move a little bit further north during the winter. We find that most of our woodcock don't stay completely stationary during the winter at all. But in the December, February timeframe, it starts to move a little bit further north, looking for more resources until it ends up in Southern Virginia. Spring migration for woodcock usually kicks off around February 15th. Once again, there's a lot of variability in that. But around February 11th, this bird initiated migration and flew the entire migratory distance in a single bout of 400 miles, right back to the exact site it was captured, near Great Swamp Wildlife Management Area in Rhode Island. So that really demonstrates, first off, the amazing fidelity that these birds can travel 400, 500 miles in a single bout and still manage to find the exact area in which they were born. But also really the incredibly detailed information, both in migratory timing. We can get survival information from this by determining when these transmitters stop transmitting. This usually means that the bird has been eaten. And we also can determine habitat use and try and use that to better conserve these birds. But if you have any questions, this would be another great spot to stop before we move on to the third section of the presentation.
I don't know if this is a question so much, but Janet mentioned in the chat MODIS towers. Maybe she's wondering if you use MODIS as well. Some of our Harris Center folks might be familiar with that because we have a MODIS receiving station on one of our conserved lands in the Monadnock region. But I know that's a different type of migration research than the satellite transmitters you're describing. Do you also use MODIS?
So our lab uses MODIS. This particular species, we do not use MODIS on. So for those who are not familiar, I'm going to attempt to do a brief overview because I don't use it particularly. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. MODIS is a system where you have these radio receiver towers set up all across North and Central America. that can receive transmissions from transmitters that fly by. And so the real appeal of the MODIS system is you can get a very light transmitter that you can put on, say, a butterfly, as our lab does, that sends out a radio signal that any passing radio tower can pick up. So the real appeal of MODIS is that they're very, very small, and you can put them on really small species like butterflies and migratory warblers. That being said, because woodcock are a little bit bigger, we can put bigger transmitters on them, and bigger transmitters means that we can get a whole lot more accurate data. And so we can get really high resolution habitat data, for example, from these transmitters that you really can't quite get from the MODIS system. And same works for migratory timing and also migratory survival.
Great, thank you. One more question about site fidelity. You mentioned this one bird returned specifically to the area where it was initially tagged. Phil Brown, who's the Harris Center's bird conservation director, is asking, is site fidelity typically high for breeding areas, and what about for wintering sites?
Let's see. We tend to find that it is high for both breeding and wintering sites. I have not calculated it yet. It is going to be in my dissertation, but I believe it's going to be roughly 50% of birds return to their original breeding site and roughly 50% return to their wintering site. It tends to be higher in certain areas. So for example, if you have a really great woodcock breeding and wintering site, those birds might end up coming back year after year after year.
Another question is, earthworms in February, are they still eating earthworms in February? Can they find them when it's so cold?
So that's an interesting point. Yes. So what birds will do is that they will essentially follow the frost line. So as soon as the ground thaws enough for earthworms to be accessible, these woodcock will start to move into those new recently thawed areas. And they really like areas where the snow has just melted, because all of that water going down into the soil pushes the earthworms up, and the woodcock feast on that. And so during the spring migration in particular, one reason why you see so many stops and why the spring migration for woodcock is so much visible is that they're bouncing back and forth across this snow and frost line as they're trying to get this recently thawed ground where all those earthworms are super available.
That's so fascinating. What an amazing thing to think about. Karen's wondering how long they live, individual woodcock.
So woodcock are probably more closely aligned to what we might call an R-selected species. They have a lot of offspring, and very few of those offspring actually make it to maturity. So the average woodcock, unfortunately, does not make it to the full 1 year mark. That being said, there are long-lived woodcock. A 3 or 4 year old woodcock would not be out of the question, certainly, although the vast majority of woodcock do not reach that age.
And one last question for now is how they navigate. Are they using stars to help them find their way? Do we know? Excellent
question. I am not aware of any research that has been done on woodcock specifically. That being said, the world of bird navigation research is absolutely fascinating. And if you have any chance, if viewers have any chance to look at a popular science article on it, it's really something to be seen. The most literature agrees, I think, at this point that the majority of birds use a mix of signals in order to navigate. Some of those signals include magnetism. They can actually detect slight variations and tilts in the Earth's magnetic field. They use UV light actually to navigate. Some of them closer to the Rockies, which is probably not woodcock as much, can actually use infrasound, which is this very low frequency sound that's created by wind going over the Rocky Mountains. As woodcock are a little bit further from the Rocky Mountains, that's not quite as applicable to them. But then a whole lot of birds, and I think this is probably largely the case for woodcock, use landmarks, actually. And so we see a lot of woodcock taking the same migratory routes as they head north and south. And there's one woodcock in particular that stopped over on the same army depot on its way north and south, just really like that stopover habitat. And so we think a lot of these birds, and woodcock in particular, are doing things like following interstates or recognizing the lights of certain cities as they make their migratory routes. And they actually learn their own migratory paths and learn where they're supposed to be going.
That's amazing. Wow. There are a couple more questions, but I want to make sure you have time to get to your third section. So why don't we move on? And then if we still have time at the end, we'll ask the few other questions that have come in.
Perfect, thanks. So for the final section, I'd like to speak a little bit about what woodcock can teach us about bird migration in general, and specifically some of the early results we've started to get out of this project. The project's about 5 years old, and our data set is really just hitting the point where it's super mature and we can start getting a lot of these really interesting questions. And we have a whole bunch of really great faculty and graduate students who are working to do just that. But before we get into that, I'd like to speak a little bit more about kind of the general, what we might expect generally from bird migration. So this is an example of what we might consider a typical migrant when we think of a bird migration, which is actually a latitudinal migration. The bird heads north during the spring and then south again during the fall. So this here is a yellow warbler that winters in the neotropics of Central and South America, and then heads north in the spring, up into the US and Canada, and back south again during this fall. So this is kind of the baseline bird migration that I'd like to build off of. And there are a whole lot of birds in North America that do just this, or something very similar. But as these transmitter studies are becoming more prevalent, we're also learning that bird migration can frequently be a lot more complex than just latitudinal migration. So one example here is the ferruginous hawk, which does engage in latitudinal migration. During the fall, it heads south. During the spring, it heads north. But during the summer, they do something called facultative migration, which is essentially these birds migrate when the food runs out. So ferruginous hawks are not the only species that does this. One very common species that's a renowned facultative migrant is the American robin. And actually a whole bunch of recent research has gone into trying to figure out exactly how robin migrations work. But for facultative migrants, they will stay put in an area until that food starts to run out. And then if that food starts to run out, they will undergo a migration, as you can see during these ferruginous hawk summer migrations. Instead of just heading straight north or south, these migrations can often be a little bit wibbly wobbly everywhere, to wherever they think food availability might be a little bit higher. Woodcock are another example of a bird that doesn't quite follow the traditional migratory framework. If we look at the bulk of individuals, they do fit fairly cleanly into a latitudinal migration. So they winter down here, roughly south of Richmond, Virginia, and then they migrate north during the spring. They summer up here in the northern US and Canada, and they move back south again during the fall. And indeed, the vast majority of woodcock nests do occur in the northern extent of their range, just as we'd expect from a more traditional migrant such as the yellow warbler. That being said, there are a non-insignificant number of nests that we find every year that occur in the wintering range. And so one really big question we have about woodcock is, how does this fit into their migration? Some woodcock, we think, are likely foregoing their migration entirely and spending their entire season down here in the wintering range. That's a phenomenon that we call partial migration. There's another phenomenon which we don't understand quite as well, which seems to be woodcock nesting in the wintering range before migration. And I'll be talking a little bit more about Colby Slezak's work on this later, where woodcock attempt to nest down the wintering range, and then if that nest doesn't work out for some reason, maybe it's predated, those woodcock will actually initiate migration after nesting, and then attempt to nest again after that migratory movement. But before I get into that, I'd like to speak a little bit about the research group that has been working on this. This research has been taking place in 2 labs. The first lab at the University of Maine is under Eric Blomberg and Amber Roth, 2 professors who started the project, and includes an undergraduate, Katie another graduate student, Alex Fish, and myself. These two students, actually, Katie and Alex, have graduated in the last couple of years, leaving me as the sole survivor at this point, although I'm shortly to have a couple more lab members working on this project. And there's also another lab at the University of Rhode Island under Scott McWilliams, who has a student, Colby Slezak, who is working on these projects. And so I'll be going over a little bit in brief each of these projects that we're working on and some of the things we're learning about these woodcock. So first, Katie Treblecock really recently completed a rather amazing, actually, undergraduate thesis on this work, where she researched how woodcock respond to severe weather events during their migration. So severe weather events for woodcock might include low temperatures. Let's say they're moving north into an area which is a lot colder than the area they came from. Low visibility due to fog, high snowfall, which, as you imagine, would be an issue for a bird that eats from the ground, and also really strong wind events. And so Katie was interested in how woodcock respond to these events during migration, whether they'd attempt to shelter in place, move to a local area where they might be a little bit more insulated from these severe weather events, or whether they'd attempt to make these longer movements, such as reverse migrations, turning around and heading back the same way they came, or continuing migration and just trying to barrel through the severe weather and try and find some better areas on the other side. And what Katie found was that predominantly these birds, despite being very dependent on finding earthworms in thawed soil, will actually just shelter in place, even when they have really severe weather events such as snowfalls, which would inhibit them finding food. What they'll do is they'll find the nearest site under like a pine tree, they'll bundle up and they'll just try and wait it out, which is really an astounding feat from a very small bird, especially in really large snowstorms. Alex Fish worked on a number of topics, but some of his more prominent work is on the survival of woodcock during migration. So for most migratory birds, we think that that migration is a very dangerous time of year for them. We know that for most birds, such as warblers, that's when a really large proportion of mortality occurs. Alex has found that actually migration is one of the safest times for woodcock. So before migration, as you can see with this green line here, there's actually a fairly low survival rate for woodcock. During migration, it's much, much higher. And right after migration, survival is very, very low. So unlike the vast majority of other migrants, for some reason, woodcock are very safe during migration. I'm not entirely sure why that's the case yet, and we're working on trying to figure out exactly where the signal might be coming from. Colby's work is really interesting. What Colby has been doing is he's been using our GPS data set to try and identify woodcock nests remotely. And this occurs at essentially continental scale. We've had nests as far south as Alabama and as far north as northern Quebec. We had a collaborator tell us this week that he could not find anyone to check on a nest because there weren't any people up where that particular woodcock nest was. It was just that far north. And so Colby has really done something really stunning, which he's managed to find collaborators literally across the United States and Canada who are willing to go out and help find these woodcock nests from our woodcock, which really just spread out across the entire continent. It's really an astounding thing that he's done. And he's found some really interesting results in that woodcock will migrate between nesting attempts, which is something that we did not know that they did, and plays into a really interesting framework in that other birds which are closely related to them also do other strange things with nesting and migration and mating. And we're still trying to puzzle out exactly what that means and where these birds fall. My work, which I have 2 slides on because I'm the one giving the presentation, focuses more on woodcock out of season movements and also their habitat use. So I'm looking at how birds move outside of the migratory seasons, and we're usually paying a little bit less attention to woodcock movements because I think these movements are particularly interesting. So during the spring, especially at the end of the spring movement, when they're transitioning into that breeding stage, what I've been finding is that a lot of these birds don't really seem to settle down, especially at the northern extent of their range. So this red bird up here, for example, we'd expect to eventually sit down and sit still in some area in Nova Scotia. Instead, it continues really long range movements into actually June, when we think that this bird should be settling down, starting to use resources. Instead, it's making very energy intensive movements. We're not entirely sure why. My best guess is that they're trying to find resources which are otherwise scarce at that high latitude. But it's really kind of unclear why this is happening. This is an area of active research. We've also found that woodcock undergo late midsummer migrations, which is something that we did not expect. Some birds decide to make their fall migration in early July or even late June, instead of waiting until the next fall migration. This is something that has been observed before in shorebirds, and it's just being observed now in woodcock. We're not entirely sure why this is the case. We've only observed it happen twice so far, but we programmed our transmitters this year in hopes of capturing more evidence of these movements. Finally, a lot of my research has gone into how to model woodcock habitat. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about is trying to take our habitat models, which are a dime a dozen in wildlife management, and trying to package those in a way that they can be best used by the state agencies, which frequently pay the bills, and also the private citizens who might be most interested in trying to put our results to good use in wildlife management. And so a lot of what I do is actually application design and creating these interactive decision-making tools, such as one I've created for the Pennsylvania state government, that they can use to interactively go through several management scenarios where they're, in this case, managing for both woodcock breeding and migratory habitat. And they can shift their priorities between those two habitat types to see which areas might be most important to conserve based on their own priorities. And so that's something that I really have just gotten into during the last 2 years. I think it's hopefully going to be really effective in disseminating our results from this project later on, and I'm hoping to build quite a few more of these. So for the next steps for this research, we are continuing to deploy transmitters, although our data set is reaching a mature stage in which we can finally start to dig into some of these locations and get some really interesting results out of it. This fall, I will be traveling with hopefully a new PhD student to Vermont and Nova Scotia to deploy some more tags. I cannot wait to go to Nova Scotia. And we'll be also bringing on some new students and researchers at two new institutions. Well, when I say new institutions, I mean the University of Maine and also University of New York Brockport, or SUNY Brockport, excuse me, to analyze some of this data and help us to learn a little bit more about woodcock and explore this data set that Eric and Amber have created. But before I finish, I'd be remiss not to thank our 34 organizational collaborators who have engaged in this research. This includes the dozens and dozens of biologists and technicians who have spent countless hours trapping these woodcock and crisscrossing the multiple countries to try and find their nests. I'd also like to thank the Harris Center for having me today. It's been a real pleasure presenting for you all. And if you have any more interest in this research, as I said, we basically get real-time migration data, and I upload it weekly on woodcockmigration.org. So please go to this page and explore our woodcock migratory movements. Love to have you interact with the project more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liam. That was fascinating. It's so amazing to think that the things we thought we understood about migration are maybe just scratching the surface. So there's still time. We're running a little late, but there's time for just a couple more questions maybe. One that was mentioned before was a question about their major predators, whether it's mostly mammals or whether owls or other avian predators might be playing a role.
That's a really interesting question. And that's, I think, something that we really do not have a good universal answer on. Predation studies are really common in wildlife management, and the results tend to vary quite a lot, especially regionally, seasonally, throughout time. So what that means is that during certain seasons, such as say raptor migration, you might start to see woodcock become a whole lot more susceptible to raptors. In certain areas where you might have more land predators, such as foxes, you might see a lot more predation to mammals. So it really depends on where you are and what season you're in. I think that that's going to be likely a big challenge for woodcock management going forward, is trying to get a good idea of what predation is occurring where. That being said, during woodcock migration, they tend to be very vulnerable when they end up in very urban areas like cities. So you'll see the Wild Bird Fund post a lot of social media stuff about woodcock that have ended up stranded in New York City, for example. And in those urban areas, woodcock can be very vulnerable to feral cats. And so please do keep your cats inside because they can be a very harmful predator for woodcock and other migratory birds.
Yeah, thank you for that, Liam. And there's a lot of window strikes happening in New York that the Wild Bird Fund talks about, which was really stunning to me to think about woodcock flying through New York City or, running into buildings on their way, unfortunately. There's another question about mowing and mowing fields. I'm assuming that's, in support of woodcock breeding the way that we think about, mowing regimes for grassland birds. Do you have any thoughts to share on that for people who might have wet meadows or fields in their purview?
Oh gosh, let's see. So they tend to like grassy fields that are just a little bit overgrown. So I was saying before, 4 to 6 inches of kind of taller grass, just enough to really cover the woodcock, but not enough that the woodcock has a hard time taking off after it has, if it has been spooked for some reason. So they want to be able to move through it nimbly, but there needs to be enough grassy cover that it can be obstructed from any predators. They tend to like those fields that they use during the night when they're kind of interspersed with woodlots around. The more low cover that those woodlots have, the better, because that's the area that they use during the daytime. And so thinking of the areas you're hoping to manage for woodcock in a larger landscape context is really important. I would also say that for getting region-specific advice, you really can't go wrong with talking to your local state game agency, for example. Many of them have really great resources for managing habitat for woodcock and other species, and also groups such as the American Woodcock Society, which provides some information on this as well.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's a great place to wrap up. So if you could see us, if we were there in person, we'd all be clapping and cheering and appreciating you taking the time to share your work with us. It's really fascinating. And